It was just another long evening at the city hospital. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, and the sound of rain hitting the windows made the quiet halls feel even more tired. Inside the emergency ward, a nurse moved quickly between patients. Her steps were light, but her face showed the exhaustion that came from years of working in a place where every minute mattered. She had always been known as the kind nurse. The one who never lost patience, no matter how busy things got. Her coworkers admired how she treated every patient like family. It wasn't just a job for her. It was something she felt deeply in her heart. Maybe that's why her work often stayed with her even after she went home. She couldn't easily forget the faces she saw, or the stories that ended too soon. That night had started like many others. The ward was filled with the steady rhythm of machines, the distant voices of doctors, and the occasional rush of stretchers being pushed through the doors. The nurse had just finished checking the blood pressure of an elderly woman when the phone at the counter rang. A paramedic's voice on the other end said they were bringing in a heart attack patient. Male, around 70 years old, condition critical. ETA, 5 minutes. She hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and began preparing the room. The air suddenly felt heavier, like time itself had slowed. She had seen countless emergencies, but she always felt that same flicker of anxiety before each one. It wasn't fear, it was care. She wanted every patient to make it. When the ambulance arrived, the doors burst open and a cold rush of air entered with it. The patient was on a stretcher, pale and barely conscious. The paramedics were already doing chest compressions as they shouted out his vitals. 71 cardiac arrest, no pulse for 2 minutes. The nurse moved quickly, helping attach the monitors and IV lines. The doctors shouted orders and she responded almost automatically, years of experience guiding her hands. But while she worked, she couldn't help noticing the man's face. He had kind eyes even though they were closed, and his hand twitched slightly, as if trying to reach for someone. She gently placed her hand over his and whispered, "You're okay, we're here. Stay with us." For nearly 30 minutes, the team fought to bring him back. The nurse could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she counted compressions, replaced equipment, and handed over medication. At one point, the monitor flickered. There was a faint pulse, but it didn't last. The room fell quiet except for the steady rain outside. When the doctor finally called the time of death, everyone stepped back. The nurse stood still for a moment, staring at the man's hand, still warm. She didn't know his name yet, but something about him made her feel an unexpected sadness. She had seen many people pass away before, but for some reason this one stayed with her longer. After the body was taken to the morgue, she sat down in the staff lounge. The clock read almost midnight. She rubbed her tired eyes, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something unfinished about that moment. It was as if the man had wanted to say something before leaving, but the words never came. Later, when she went home, she tried to leave her thoughts at the hospital like she always did. But as she lay in bed listening to the rain outside, her mind replayed the scene again and again. The way his hand moved slightly, the look of peace that had crossed his face at the end. She whispered softly into the dark, "I hope you weren't alone." Days turned into weeks. The hospital went back to its usual rhythm, emergencies, recoveries, and the occasional quiet miracle that reminded everyone why they did this job. But the memory of that patient stayed somewhere in the back of her mind. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the hospital. It was addressed to her by name. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, old-fashioned, the kind that looked like it had been written with care. The return address was unfamiliar, but it caught her attention immediately. At first, she thought it might be a thank you note from a family member. That sometimes happened when someone passed away. Their loved ones would write to express gratitude for the care their relative received. She smiled softly at the thought and slipped the letter into her pocket, planning to read it later during her break. Hours later, during her short lunch break, she sat near a window overlooking the parking lot and opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper. As soon as she unfolded it, her hands froze. The first line read, "Dear nurse, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here." Her heart skipped a beat. The signature at the bottom made her breath catch. It was the same name as the man she couldn't save. For a few moments, she just stared at the letter, her eyes wide. How could this be? How could he have written to her if he had passed away weeks ago? She began to read. He had written that he'd been in the hospital a few weeks before his heart attack. He had come in for chest pain, and she had been one of the nurses who looked after him. He remembered how she had talked to him kindly, how she'd asked about his day and brought him an extra blanket when he felt cold. He wrote that those small moments had stayed with him. "I don't think you would even remember me," the letter said, "but I remember you. People think kindness doesn't make a difference. But you made me feel seen. You reminded me that I still mattered even when I had nothing left." The nurse's eyes filled with tears. She tried to remember that day. She vaguely recalled an elderly man who had smiled at her when she gave him his medication. Someone quiet but gentle. She hadn't known his name then, and she hadn't realized he had noticed her kindness so deeply. The letter went on. He wrote about his life, how he had lost his wife years ago and had no family left nearby. He had spent most days alone, talking only to the shopkeeper near his home or the nurse at the clinic. But he said that during his hospital stay something had changed. "I saw how you treated everyone," he wrote. "Even when people were rude or scared, you never lost patience. You cared. That's rare. It made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore." By the time she reached the end of the letter, her hands were shaking. His final words were simple. "If you ever feel tired or think your work doesn't matter, please remember this. You made one old man believe that kindness still exists. Thank you for that." She sat there silently for a long time, unable to move. The letter was dated 2 days before he had passed away. It was as if he had known what was coming and wanted to leave something behind. Not for his family, but for her. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She went through the motions, checking charts, adjusting drips, and talking to patients, but her mind kept returning to that letter. It felt like a message meant not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt helpless after losing someone. That night, after work, she stopped by the hospital chapel. It was quiet and dimly lit, with only a few candles burning. She sat in the back row, holding the letter close to her heart. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. They weren't tears of guilt or regret this time, they were tears of something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding. She whispered softly, "Thank you for writing to me." Outside, the rain began again, light and steady against the windows. She watched it for a while, thinking about how strange life could be, how people crossed paths for only a moment and still managed to change each other's lives forever. When she finally stood up to leave, she folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her notebook. She didn't know why, but she felt lighter. Maybe it was because, for the first time, she realized that even though she couldn't save every patient, she could still make a difference, and somehow, she knew that was enough. The next morning started quietly, but something inside her had changed. The nurse woke up early, long before her alarm rang, and sat by the window with a cup of tea in her hands. The letter from the old man lay on the table beside her, folded neatly as if it carried a fragile secret. She had read it several times already, but every time she looked at those words, she felt something stir inside her, something between warmth and sadness. When she reached the hospital, the ward looked the same as always. The same white walls, the same busy voices, and the same smell of antiseptic that never really left. But for her, everything felt slightly different now. Every patient she looked at reminded her of him in some small way. The tired eyes, the trembling hands, the quiet hope that someone would care. She tried to focus on her usual routine, but her mind kept wandering back to that letter. It wasn't just a thank you note. It felt like a message, like he had written it not just to thank her, but to tell her something about life that she had never stopped to think about. During her lunch break, she went outside to the hospital garden. It was her favorite spot, a small, peaceful place where patients sometimes sat to breathe in the fresh air. The flowers were just beginning to bloom, and the soft hum of bees filled the silence. She sat on a bench and took the letter out again, reading it slowly. The words still felt unreal. "You made me believe that kindness still exists." She whispered the sentence out loud, almost as if she wanted to test how it sounded in the air. The wind brushed past her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes, wondering how many people in the world were waiting for a simple act of kindness to change their day. That thought stayed with her when she returned to work. Every patient she spoke to that day, she made sure to smile a little longer, to listen a little more. She didn't realize it, but that small shift in her heart began to spread around her. Patients seemed calmer, co-workers seemed lighter. She was still tired, still overworked, but she no longer felt empty at the end of her shift. A few days later, she got a call from the hospital's administrative office. They said someone wanted to meet her, a relative of the man who had passed away. She hesitated at first. She wasn't sure what to say. Would they blame her for not being able to save him? Or did they just want to talk about his final moments? She agreed to meet. Later that afternoon, an older woman walked into the ward holding a small brown envelope. She introduced herself as the man's niece. Her eyes were kind, but filled with a quiet sadness. "He spoke about you," she said softly. "He told me about the nurse who held his hand." The nurse didn't know what to say. She smiled politely, trying to hide the lump in her throat. The woman reached into the envelope and pulled out a small photograph. It was of the old man when he was younger, standing beside a smiling woman and a little boy. The photo had faded over time, but you could still see the warmth in their eyes. "He wanted you to have this," the niece said. "He left a note with it in his will. He said you reminded him of what his wife used to be like. Kind, gentle, never giving up on people." The nurse held the photograph carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The man looked so alive in it, so full of joy. She felt her eyes fill with tears again, but this time she didn't hide them. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll take care of it." Before leaving, the woman turned back and said something that stayed in the nurse's heart for a long time. "He told me he wasn't afraid at the end. He said he felt at peace because he had met someone who reminded him of what mattered most." That night, the nurse couldn't sleep. She placed the photo on her bedside table and stared at it under the soft glow of her lamp. The old man's words from the letter echoed in her mind again and again. "If you ever feel tired or think your work doesn't matter, remember this. You made one old man believe that kindness still exists." She began to wonder how many people went through life never knowing that they had made a difference. How many moments of care or comfort went unnoticed, but still changed someone else's world in ways unseen. The next few weeks, she found herself thinking about him often. Not in a sad way, but with a strange kind of gratitude. It was as if his message had unlocked something inside her, a reminder that her purpose wasn't measured in how many lives she could save, but in how many hearts she could touch. Then one day, something unexpected happened again. A new patient was brought in, a young man in his 30s who had been injured in an accident. He was frightened, restless, and in pain. When the doctors were busy with tests, the nurse stayed beside him, trying to calm him down. She held his hand and told him softly that everything would be okay. For a moment, she saw the same fear she had seen in the old man's eyes that night. But when he looked at her, his breathing slowed and he managed a weak smile. "You remind me of someone," he whispered. She didn't ask who. She just smiled back and said, "That's good. It means you're not alone." Something in those words made her realize how the circle of kindness kept moving. The letter had reached her, and now, through her, its message was reaching others. Later that evening, as she walked home, the sky was painted with orange light from the setting sun. She stopped near a small bookstore she often passed but never entered. On a sudden impulse, she went inside. The smell of old pages filled the air, and she found herself drawn to the corner where the greeting cards were displayed. She picked one up, a simple card with a picture of a sunrise and the words, "Thank you for your kindness." She smiled, thinking about how small gestures like these could mean so much. On her way out, she noticed a small notebook on a shelf. It had a plain cover, but something about it felt special. She bought it and decided to start writing down the names and stories of people who had touched her heart during her work. Patients, co-workers, strangers. That night, she sat at her desk, opened the first page, and wrote a single sentence. "Today, I remembered that kindness never goes unnoticed." She placed the old man's letter and photograph between the pages as if they were the first entries of a story she would carry for the rest of her life. From that day forward, she made it a habit to notice the small things, the thank you smiles, the quiet tears, the way someone's eyes softened after hearing a kind word. She realized that healing wasn't only about medicine, it was also about being present, about showing people that they mattered. The next time she walked into the hospital, she didn't see just the chaos or the pressure. She saw people, each one carrying their own fears, hopes, and stories. And she promised herself that she would always be the kind of nurse who made people feel seen, just like the letter had reminded her to be. Sometimes late at night, she would take out the photograph and look at it again. The faces in it seemed to smile back at her as if saying thank you. And she would whisper back, "No, thank you for reminding me why I do this." She didn't know it yet, but that letter had set something in motion that would change her life forever. The days kept passing, And life at the hospital went on as usual, but inside her, something had shifted. She no longer saw her work the same way. The letter from the old man had become a quiet companion in her thoughts. She carried it with her, folded neatly in her pocket, almost like a reminder to keep her heart open even when things got hard. But not every day was easy. The hospital was a place where joy and heartbreak lived side by side, and some nights were harder than others. There were times when she would come home too tired to even eat, her feet aching and her mind heavy with the faces of patients she couldn't forget. One evening, after a particularly long shift, she sat in the staff lounge staring at her reflection in the vending machine's glass. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair tied loosely, and her eyes looked older than she remembered. She thought about how much energy she gave every day, every smile, every reassuring word, and wondered if it was enough. The letter had reminded her that kindness mattered. But lately, she was starting to feel the weight of giving too much of herself. It wasn't that she didn't care, she cared deeply, but sometimes caring came with pain. That night, as she walked to the bus stop, the city was quiet. The streetlights glowed softly in the misty air. She sat on the bench, feeling the chill in the wind, when she noticed a young woman standing nearby. She looked lost and scared, clutching a small bag tightly against her chest. The nurse could have stayed silent. It had been a long day and she was exhausted. But something inside her wouldn't let her ignore the woman's trembling hands. She stood up and asked gently, "Are you okay?" The woman looked up startled, then nodded quickly, though her eyes said otherwise. I'm fine," she murmured. But the nurse had seen enough fear in people's faces to know when someone wasn't fine. They sat together on the bench for a few minutes in silence. Then the woman spoke quietly. "I was visiting my brother. He's in your hospital. They said he might not make it." Her voice cracked and tears filled her eyes. "I didn't know where to go, so I just came out here." Without thinking, the nurse took her hand and said softly, "You don't have to be alone. Sometimes sitting quietly with someone is enough." They didn't talk much after that. The woman just cried quietly while the nurse stayed beside her, holding her hand until her bus arrived. Before leaving, the woman turned and whispered, "Thank you. You have no idea how much that meant." As the bus drove away, the nurse felt something stir inside her again, the same warmth she had felt when reading the letter for the first time. Maybe this was what the old man had wanted her to understand. That kindness wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting next to someone who needed to know they weren't invisible. Still, the following week tested her in ways she didn't expect. A young patient in her ward, a boy no older than 12, had been fighting a serious illness for months. Everyone in the ward had grown attached to him, especially her. She would always bring him a small paper crane or a piece of candy when he felt too weak to smile. But one morning, when she came in for her shift, she found his bed empty. Her heart sank before anyone said a word. The doctor pulled her aside and said gently, "He passed away early this morning, peacefully." She nodded, but her throat tightened. The doctor continued talking, but she couldn't hear much. The words blurred into the background. All she could see was his small empty bed and the paper crane sitting on the side table untouched. That night, she couldn't stop crying. She tried to be strong, but the pain of losing another patient, especially one so young, hit her harder than before. She took out the old man's letter and read it again, hoping it would bring comfort. But this time, instead of feeling warmth, she felt guilt. Why did he thank her when she couldn't save him? Why did people believe she made a difference when she couldn't even stop them from dying? What was the point of all her care if life kept slipping away? She folded the letter back carefully and placed it on her nightstand. The words on the page blurred through her tears. "If you ever feel tired or think your work doesn't matter, remember this." But that night she didn't believe it. The next few days she went through her shifts quietly, speaking only when necessary. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. She wasn't smiling as much, and the warmth in her voice had faded. One of her colleagues, a senior nurse who had worked there for over 30 years, pulled her aside and said, "You can't let every loss break you." "We do what we can, but we don't control the rest." She nodded, but didn't reply. Inside, she felt empty. That weekend, she visited the park near her apartment, hoping the open air would clear her mind. She sat by the pond, watching children feed ducks while their parents laughed nearby. For a moment, she thought about the boy again, the one who loved hearing stories about animals. She imagined him laughing too, healthy and carefree. A gentle breeze passed through and a small white feather floated down onto her lap. She picked it up and stared at it, a strange calm settling over her. Maybe, she thought, the old man and the boy weren't gone. Maybe they were just somewhere else. That evening, she decided to visit the hospital's chapel again. It was quiet, with only a single candle burning near the altar. She sat in the back row and whispered, "I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep doing this." The silence stretched on for a moment before she heard soft footsteps behind her. It was the hospital janitor, an older man who had worked there for years. He smiled gently and said, "Hard day?" She nodded. "Hard month." He sat beside her for a moment, looking at the candle. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been here a long time. I've seen nurses cry in this chapel more times than I can count. You all carry more weight than most people realize." She looked at him, surprised by his calmness. He continued, "You may think your job is to save lives, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's to make the moments people have left a little easier. You can't stop death, but you can stop fear. That's a kind of saving too." His words sank deep into her heart. For a long time she didn't say anything. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, "Maybe you're right." He chuckled softly. "I usually am," he said, standing up. "Now go home, kid, rest. You can't pour from an empty cup." That night, when she got home, she sat by her desk and took out her notebook, the one where she had written down the names and stories of the people who had touched her heart. On a new page she wrote, "Kindness isn't about saving lives. It's about saving moments." As she closed the book, she looked at the letter again, and for the first time since that terrible day, the words brought her comfort. The old man hadn't written to remind her of what she couldn't do. He had written to remind her of what she could. She smiled softly to herself, the tears drying on her cheeks. Outside, the moon was bright, shining through her window like a quiet promise that even in the darkest times, there was still light. She knew there would be more hard days ahead, more loss, more tears, but she also knew she would keep showing up. Not because it was easy, but because someone had once reminded her that kindness never truly fades. And maybe, someday, her words or her presence would become the letter that someone else needed to keep going. It had been months since the letter first arrived, yet the nurse still kept it with her every day. It was worn at the edges now, folded so many times that the creases had begun to fade the ink. But she didn't mind. The letter had become something more than a memory. It was a quiet reminder of purpose. Life at the hospital continued as usual. New patients arrived, others went home, and sometimes a few never left. The nurse had learned to balance her emotions better now. She still cared deeply, but she no longer let the sadness drown her. She had learned to see beauty even in the fragile moments, like when a patient smiled after a painful procedure, or when a family whispered thank you before leaving. Still, every now and then, she would wonder why the old man had chosen her to receive that letter. There were so many nurses, so many faces he could have remembered. Why her? One quiet afternoon, while organizing patient records in the staff room, she overheard two nurses talking near the door. One of them mentioned a memorial service being held that weekend for patients who had passed away in the last year. Families were invited and staff could attend if they wished. The idea stayed with her. She had never gone to one before. Usually she tried to keep some distance. It was the only way to stay emotionally steady in her line of work. But this time she felt something urging her to go. On the day of the service, the hospital's small chapel was filled with soft music and flowers. Families sat quietly in rows, holding framed photos of their loved ones. The nurse sat near the back, her hands resting on her lap. She didn't know anyone personally, but every story that was shared felt familiar. When it was time for people to speak, one woman went up to the front. The nurse recognized her, and it was the old man's niece. She carried a small framed photo, the same one she had given to the nurse months ago. "My uncle," the woman began, "was a kind man. Life didn't end gently for him, but I believe he found peace before he left us. He told me something before he passed, something that I didn't fully understand until recently." She took a shaky breath and continued. "He said that sometimes even a few kind words from a stranger can heal a heart that's been hurting for years." The nurse felt her throat tighten. She knew exactly what those words meant. The woman smiled softly. There was a nurse who cared for him during one of his hospital stays. He said she reminded him of his late wife, gentle, patient, and full of warmth. I never met her, but I want her to know she made a difference. She gave him peace. The nurse felt her heart ache in the most beautiful way. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She just listened, her soul quiet but full. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring her there at that exact moment, so she could finally hear what she needed to hear. After the ceremony ended, she walked up to the niece and introduced herself. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with emotion. "You're her," she whispered. "You're the nurse he talked about." The nurse smiled shyly. "I didn't think he remembered me that much." "He did," the woman said. "More than you could imagine. That letter he sent you, he wrote it after we talked about his will. He said he didn't want to leave behind regret. He wanted to leave gratitude. You gave him back something he had lost years ago, faith in people." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "He left something else. I didn't find it until recently, when I was going through his belongings. I think it's meant for you." The nurse hesitated, then took the envelope carefully. It was old, sealed with a single piece of clear tape. Her name was written in the same shaky handwriting she recognized instantly. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the letter resting in front of her. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. She took a deep breath and opened it. The letter was short, written in uneven lines, but every word felt heavy with meaning. "Dear nurse, if you are reading this, then my time has passed. But I wanted to tell you something more. Something I couldn't fit into the first letter. You see, the night you held my hand, I wasn't afraid anymore. I had been alone for so long that I forgot what human kindness felt like. In that small moment, you reminded me that I wasn't forgotten. You reminded me of my wife. She was a nurse too. She used to hold my hand the same way when life was hard." Her eyes blurred as she read on. "That's why I recognize something in you. Not just care, but love. The kind that asks for nothing in return. You gave me peace, and I want you to remember this whenever you doubt yourself. Your kindness reached further than you'll ever know." By the time she finished reading, tears were running freely down her cheeks. She pressed the paper against her chest and whispered, "Thank you." In that moment, something inside her shifted again. The weight she had carried for months and the guilt, the exhaustion, the questioning, all of it began to fade. She realized that her role in people's lives wasn't defined by whether they lived or died, but by whether they felt cared for in the moments they needed it most. The next morning, she arrived at the hospital early. The sky was still gray and the hallways were quiet except for the sound of her shoes on the floor. She stopped by the nurse's station and placed the old man's letter in her locker, right beside her notebook. It would stay there as a symbol, a quiet promise to never forget why she started this work. As the day went on, she found herself smiling more. When a patient thanked her for a small act of kindness, she didn't brush it off shyly like before. She accepted it fully because now she understood its value. Every thank you, every smile, every moment of care, they were proof that she was doing something that mattered. A few weeks later, she began a new project in the ward. She created a small bulletin board called Messages of Hope. Patients and staff could leave anonymous notes for anyone who had helped them, a few kind words, a story, or a thank you. Within days, the board filled up. Notes from families, patients, even other nurses appeared one by one. Some messages were simple, like, "Thank you for listening." Others were longer, sharing small moments of compassion that had gone unnoticed before. Reading them, she realized how many quiet acts of kindness were happening every day, and how powerful they really were. One night, after her shift ended, she stood by the board alone. There was a new note pinned to the center, written in small, careful handwriting. It read, "To the nurse who always believes in kindness, thank you for reminding us to care. Your light reaches further than you think." She smiled, tears filling her eyes once again. Maybe it was from a patient or maybe a coworker. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the message she once received had now become something she was passing on. A ripple of kindness that kept spreading quietly, touching lives she might never even meet. As she walked home that night, the air was cool, and the stars shimmered faintly above the hospital roof. She looked up and whispered softly, "I got your message, and I'll keep it alive." For the first time in a long while, her heart felt completely at peace. Time moved on, as it always does. The nurse's days filled with the usual rhythm of hospital life, the sound of monitors beeping, the shuffle of footsteps in the hallways, and the steady hum of quiet conversations between staff and patients. But something inside her had changed. The woman who once carried silent guilt now carried quiet peace. She had learned that every day in the hospital was a gift, even if it didn't always look like one. Some days were heavy, yes, filled with tears and loss, but others were full of laughter, recovery, and moments that reminded her why she had chosen this path. She had stopped searching for perfection and started embracing presence, being there fully for whoever needed her, for however long they had. The Messages of Hope board she had created grew week by week. It became a small corner of light in an otherwise serious place. Visitors stopped to read the notes. Staff came there during long shifts just to take a deep breath. Sometimes she caught patients smiling at the messages, their eyes shining softly as if they had found something to hold on to. One day, a young trainee nurse joined the hospital. She was nervous, constantly checking the charts twice, worried she'd make a mistake. The older nurse noticed her hesitation and remembered how it once felt to be new, unsure, and scared of failure. After a long day, she invited the trainee to sit with her in the break room. They shared tea from a paper cup and talked. The younger woman confessed that she sometimes went home feeling like she hadn't done enough, that maybe she wasn't strong enough for this job. The older nurse smiled kindly and reached into her bag. She took out a folded piece of paper, not the old man's letter, but a copy she had made of it months earlier. She placed it on the table between them and said, "I want you to read this when you doubt yourself. It helped me once." The trainee looked puzzled but accepted it. As she read the words, her eyes softened, then glistened. When she finished, she looked up and whispered, "He wrote this to you?" The nurse nodded. "He did. But over time, I realized it wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who forgets how much small kindness can matter." The younger woman folded the paper again, holding it carefully as if it were fragile. "Thank you," she said softly. That night, as the older nurse walked home under the faint streetlights, she smiled to herself. Maybe that's how kindness really worked. Not by staying in one place, but by being passed on quietly, like a flame lighting another. Months later, the hospital held its annual recognition event for staff. It wasn't a big formal thing, just a simple gathering where doctors, nurses, and staff shared their experiences from the year. There were snacks, laughter, and a few tears as stories were told. When it was the nurse's turn to speak, she stood up hesitantly. Public speaking wasn't something she enjoyed, but this time she felt a gentle urge to share something. She took a deep breath and began. "I've been a nurse here for many years," she said, her voice calm but steady, "and for a long time I thought success meant saving lives. That's what I used to measure myself by. But then something happened that changed how I saw everything. A patient I couldn't save sent me a letter. He thanked me, not because I cured him, but because I cared. And that made me realize something simple. Sometimes what people remember most isn't what we fix, but how we make them feel." The room was silent. Even the hum of the machines in the hallway seemed to fade. She continued softly. "That letter reminded me that kindness doesn't end when someone's gone. It stays, it finds new people. It heals quietly, just like time does." When she sat down, there was a long pause and then gentle applause. A few people wiped their eyes. It wasn't a speech full of fancy words, but it came straight from the heart, and everyone felt it. Later that night, when she went back to her locker, she found a small folded note stuck to the door. It simply said, "You remind us why this work matters. Thank you." She smiled and placed the note next to the old man's letter. They didn't belong to the same story, but they shared the same message: kindness, once given, never disappears. As the months turned into a year, she continued her work with the same dedication but a lighter heart. She still faced long shifts and difficult nights, but she no longer carried the weight of self-blame. Whenever a patient didn't make it, she still felt sadness, but she also found comfort in knowing she had been there for them in their final moments. She had learned that being present was sometimes the greatest medicine of all. One winter evening, after finishing her shift, she walked through the hospital garden. It was quiet, and the lamps along the pathway glowed softly against the frost. She stopped near a bench and noticed something new. A small plaque had been placed there. It read, "In memory of those who taught us the meaning of care." She sat down for a moment, breathing in the cold air, watching her breath form little clouds that vanished into the night. She thought of the old man, of his niece, of the many faces that had come and gone through those hospital halls. She thought of the letter that had changed everything, and for the first time she didn't feel the familiar ache of loss. She felt gratitude and deep and quiet. Some stories don't end with a dramatic twist. Some end in peace, in stillness, in understanding. That's how her story ended. Not with fanfare, but with calm acceptance that every life she touched had touched her too. She kept working at the hospital for many more years. Her kindness became something people spoke about, not in big words, but in passing remarks. Like she has a way of making you feel safe, or she listens like she really cares. And that, to her, was the highest praise she could ever hope for. Years later, after she retired, she took the old man's original letter out one last time. She sat near her window, sunlight spilling across the table, and read it slowly. The paper was fragile now, the ink slightly faded, but the message remained strong, untouched by time. She smiled as she folded it carefully and placed it inside a small wooden box along with a few other keepsakes. A name tag, a photo of her co-workers, and a handwritten card from a patient's family. Then she closed the box gently and whispered, "Thank you for finding me," because deep down, she knew that letter hadn't just been a goodbye from a dying man. It had been a gift, a reminder of purpose sent at the exact moment she needed it. Years later, when the nurse passed away peacefully in her sleep, her family went through her things. Among the few belongings she left behind was that small wooden box. Inside it, they found the letter. The ink was faint but still readable. Her daughter, who had often heard her mother speak about the importance of kindness, read the letter and smiled through her tears. She decided to frame it and place it on her desk at the local clinic where she worked, continuing her mother's legacy in her own quiet way. Every now and then, patients would glance at the framed letter and ask about it. She would tell them the story, about a nurse, a patient, and a message that had crossed from one life to another, carrying with it the same truth, that compassion never fades. And so the letter lived on, not just in paper, but in hearts, reminding everyone who read it that even in moments of loss, love leaves behind something that doesn't die. Years passed. Seasons changed quietly, and so did people. The hospital had grown bigger, newer wings built, new technology installed, new faces joining the staff. But somewhere in one of its quiet corridors, the memory of the kind nurse still lingered. Her name was spoken softly among those who had worked beside her, never in the past tense, but as if she was still part of the place. The nurse's daughter, now a grown woman herself, often visited the same hospital. She worked as a community health volunteer, helping elderly patients who didn't have families to visit them. Every time she walked through those hallways, she felt her mother's presence. There were days when the smell of disinfectant and the soft beeping of machines brought back old memories. Her mother's uniform folded neatly on the chair, her tired but gentle smile when she came home after a long shift. One afternoon, as the daughter sat at her small clinic desk, an elderly man came in for a checkup. He looked frail, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were kind. He sat down slowly and smiled, saying, "You remind me of someone." She laughed lightly. "I get that a lot. Who do I remind you of?" He paused for a moment, as if searching his memory. "A nurse," he said finally. "Long time ago, when I was in the hospital after an accident, she used to talk to me like I mattered, even when I thought my life didn't." Her smile faded into something softer. "Do you remember her name?" He shook his head. "No, but I remember her voice. Gentle, like she understood pain without you having to say a word." The daughter's heart warmed. "My mother was a nurse too. Maybe it was her." "Maybe," he said, his voice quiet. "If it was, tell her she made an old man's life a little less lonely." The daughter nodded, but she didn't tell him her mother had already passed. Instead, she just said, "I'll tell her." After he left, she sat for a while in silence. It amazed her how her mother's kindness still seemed to echo through time, finding its way back in unexpected moments like this. Maybe that was what true compassion did. It didn't fade with distance or death. It stayed, hidden in memories and small acts, resurfacing when someone needed it. That evening, she went home and looked at the framed letter on her wall, the one her mother had kept for years. The words had faded a little, but she could still read them clearly. Sometimes she read it out loud, as if she were speaking to both the man who wrote it and the mother who received it. She decided to start something new in her mother's memory. The next day, she printed a dozen copies of the letter, framed them, and placed them in different hospitals, clinics, and old-age homes under a small title, "A Message for Those Who Care." At first, she wasn't sure if anyone would notice, but a few weeks later she received a call from a nurse at a nearby hospital. "I don't know who you are," the woman said, "but your letter, the one on our wall, has become something special here. Staff come by during breaks just to read it. It gives us strength on the hard days." The daughter smiled quietly. "That letter belonged to my mother once," she said. "I'm just passing it on." And so it continued, quietly, humbly, beautifully. More hospitals requested copies. Some people printed their own. A few translated it into different languages so patients could understand it too. Soon, what had once been a private exchange between a dying man and a nurse had turned into something that reached hundreds of hearts. In one hospital, a young nurse who was struggling with burnout read the letter during her night shift. She had been thinking about quitting. The long hours, the endless emotional strain, it had worn her down. But as she read the words, "You reminded me I wasn't forgotten," she broke down and cried quietly in the corner of the nurse's station. That single moment reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place. She stayed. In another city, an elderly patient recovering from surgery asked to see the letter again before he was discharged. He told the staff, This is what the world needs to remember. We heal not just with medicine, but with love." Years later, the daughter received a letter in the mail from someone she didn't know. It was handwritten, and the first line made her eyes well up immediately. "Dear daughter of the nurse," it began. "I found your mother's story through a copy of the letter hanging in our hospital. I just wanted you to know. It saved me." The writer explained that she had been a young medical student, overwhelmed and on the verge of giving up after losing a patient for the first time. She had seen the framed letter on the wall, read it again and again, and realized that caring isn't about always succeeding. It's about being there, even when things don't go the way you hoped. "Your mother never met me," the letter continued, "but she helped me find my way back to who I wanted to be. I just wanted to thank you for keeping her light alive." The daughter pressed the paper against her heart the same way her mother once did. For a long while she just sat there, eyes closed, whispering softly, "You're still helping people, Mom." A few months later, she was invited to speak at a small community event for healthcare workers. She brought the original letter with her, the one written so many years ago. She stood on stage holding it gently and said, "This letter started as a goodbye, but over time it became something else. A bridge between lives, between people who never met, between pain and hope. My mother taught me that healing isn't just something nurses do with medicine. It's something we all do with kindness." The audience sat in silence, moved not by fancy words but by the truth they all felt deep inside. After the event, many came up to her to ask for copies of the letter, wanting to hang them in their hospitals, clinics, and classrooms. And so the message continued to spread, softly but endlessly, like ripples on calm water, years down the line. The letter became known by a simple phrase printed at the bottom of each framed version, inspired by a nurse who once held a patient's hand. And in that quiet way, the story lived on. The old man's words outlived him. The nurse's kindness outlived her. The daughter's devotion carried both their spirits forward. People often said the world had grown cold. That kindness was rare, but somewhere in a hospital corridor, a tired nurse would pause, read that letter, and smile. Somewhere a lonely patient would find comfort, knowing someone once cared deeply enough to be remembered, forever. And that was the beauty of it. The simplest act of humanity had become immortal without ever trying to be. One evening, years later, the daughter visited the same hospital garden where her mother used to sit after her shifts. The plaque was still there, in memory of those who taught us the meaning of care. She placed a small flower beside it and whispered, "He was right, Mom. Your kindness reached further than you ever knew." As she looked up at the fading sky, a gentle breeze brushed against her cheek, and for a second, she swore she could hear her mother's voice, and calm, warm and full of love, and saying, "Keep caring. That's how we live forever." She smiled, holding back tears, and whispered, "I will." And somewhere in that quiet space between life and memory, Mo, the nurse, the patient, and the daughter were all connected, bound by the one thing that never fades, the simple, powerful truth that kindness is the one medicine the world will always need.